The December evening had settled over the small town with a kind of quiet that Richard Hayes had always cherished. At 65, he found peace in routines, reading the evening paper in his recliner, a cup of strong coffee cooling on the side table, and the faint ticking of the old clock above the mantel. Outside, the wind scraped against the bare branches, rattling them against the windows like impatient fingers. Winter in his part of the Midwest was always unforgiving, but Richard liked it that way. It made the warmth of his home, the home he had built with his own hands alongside his late wife, Martha, feel even more like a fortress. The knock came suddenly, sharp and insistent, breaking the stillness. Not one polite rap, but a heavy pounding that made the glass panes of the front door tremble. Richard lowered the paper slowly, his brows knitting. At this hour, he checked the clock. 7:30 p.m. Neighbors knew better than to drop by unannounced on a weeknight. His mind jumped to emergencies. A break-in nearby, maybe Mrs. Patterson across the street needed help. When he opened the door, however, it wasn't a neighbor shivering on the porch. It was his son, Eric, shoulders tense under a wrinkled dress shirt, his jaw set in a way that immediately pulled Richard back to the boy's teenage years, when rebellion was a permanent expression. Behind him stood Sophie, Eric's wife, arms crossed, her breath puffing white in the frigid air. She didn't greet him. Instead, she let her eyes travel around the frame of the doorway, as if she were already stepping into a place she thought would be hers. Before Richard could ask what was wrong, Eric brushed past him, the cold air rushing in with him. "We need to talk, Dad." His voice was clipped, almost brittle. Sophie followed, clicking the door shut with deliberate force. She glanced at the built-in shelves Richard had carved years ago, the polished oak floor that had taken him 2 summers to finish, and the crown molding that Martha had painted by hand. Her eyes lingered, not with admiration, but with calculation. Richard's chest tightened as he stepped back toward his recliner, suddenly feeling like a guest in his own home. "What's this about, Eric?" Eric began pacing near the fireplace, his shoes clicking against the wood floor. His usually neat hair was disheveled, as though he had been pulling at it during the drive over. "It's about this house, Dad. About the money you're sitting on while we're struggling." The words hit harder than Richard expected. He had heard frustration in his son's voice before, but this tone carried a different edge, sharp, accusatory. "Struggling? You've got a decent job, a roof over your head, 2 beautiful kids." "A cramped 2-bedroom apartment," Sophie cut in, her voice quick and cold. "Clara has been sleeping in the living room, for heaven's sake. Daniel barely has space for his school projects. You think that's a decent life?" Richard gripped the back of his recliner, steadying himself. "Eric, this house represents 40 years of my life. Every nail, every board, every winter night, Martha and I spent planning it together. After I'm gone, it will be yours. Everything will be yours." "That's not good enough." Eric's voice cracked, his face flushed with a mix of anger and desperation. "We need a bigger place now, not when you're in the ground. You could sell this house today, move into a retirement community, and use the equity to actually help your family." Sophie softened her tone, stepping closer like a performer switching roles. Mid-scene. "Richard, be reasonable. The kids need space. They need opportunities we can't provide. We're living paycheck to paycheck while you sit here in comfort." "Reasonable?" Richard's voice rose, heat burning in his chest. "You call selling the home your mother and I built reasonable? This place is my life's work. Every board I cut, every wall I raised, every coat of paint Martha brushed on, this house is her. It's us." "You're being selfish, Dad." Eric stopped pacing and looked his father in the eye. "Completely selfish. What good is your life's work if it doesn't help your family when we need it most?" The accusation sliced deep, deeper than Richard wanted to admit. He had spent decades in construction, working overtime shifts through blistering summers and brutal winters. He had saved every penny to build not just a house, but a legacy, and now his son, his own flesh and blood, was calling him selfish for wanting to live in it. The silence stretched between them, heavy and brittle. Richard's hands trembled as he released his grip on the chair. When he finally spoke, his words were calm, almost too quiet. "Get out, and both of you, get out of my house." Eric's eyes widened, then narrowed into a glare. "Fine, but this isn't over. We'll find another way." Sophie followed him to the door, not bothering to hide the disdain in her eyes as she looked once more around the living room. Then, without another word, they left. The front door slammed shut, rattling the frames on the wall and leaving Richard in a ringing silence. Through the frosted window, he watched their taillights disappear into the December night. Only then did he feel his legs trembling beneath him, his heart pounding against his ribs. The house around him, his sanctuary, his masterpiece, suddenly felt under siege. Richard Hayes sank into his recliner, the leather creaking beneath his weight, and stared at the mantel where Martha's photograph smiled, from within its silver frame. He had never felt more like a stranger in his own home. Silence arrived late, like a guest embarrassed to come in after a door has already slammed. Richard sat very still in the chair that knew the shape of his shoulders, his hands tented over his stomach, while the furnace hummed its steady reassurance through the vents. The house felt as if it were listening with him, the joists holding their breath, the wallpaper quieting to a hush. Only the clock above the mantel dared to keep speaking, meting out the seconds he could not gather back. He rose when the heat cut off and the sigh of the ductwork faded. The living room seemed different by a single conversation. It was absurd, and yet there it was. Corners sharper, colors leaner, air colder around the window panes. He crossed to the mantel and touched the bevel he had carved along its edge, the profile still crisp after so many winters. The wood remembered him. It always did. He let his fingertips travel the length of the shelf to the silver frame that held Martha's summer smile. She had been laughing at something he no longer remembered, some neighbor's dog, some crooked pie crust, some song on the radio, and the laugh had frozen there like a candle flame. "I didn't think we'd see a night like this," he said, and because the room gave back no answer, he listened to the way his own voice sounded in the house they made. He tried to shake the conversation from his head, but sentences settled on him like snow in the eaves. Selfish, hoard, move out after you're gone. Words with edges. He carried them with him into the hall, into the room that still smelled faintly of cedar and starch, into the closet where Martha's blue dress lived in the dark like a secret he hadn't told. He didn't part the hangers. He stood with the door open to the shadowed hush, steadying his breath, letting that familiar scent do again what it had done for decades. Calm him, put a hand to his shoulder, remind him that not all storms are worth stepping into. On the dresser, a wooden toy car sat beside a dish of loose change. He picked it up and rolled its little wheels with his thumb. He had whittled it for Daniel last summer on the back steps, the boy leaning in with the kind of attention only 10-year-olds and craftsmen can manage. "How do you make the wheels round?" Daniel had asked, and Richard had laughed and said, "You take off everything that isn't a wheel." Clara had painted the windows with a shaky brush, leaving 3 bright swipes of white along the side like sunlight. He closed his eyes and placed the car back on the dresser as if returning a bird to its nest. He could hear Martha in his memory. Never the exact words, always the cadence. When people are unkind, something underneath is hungry or afraid. It had irritated him when she said it about telemarketers and irritable clerks. It irritated him now to think of it with his own son. Afraid of what? A cramped apartment. Bills that caught fire as soon as you paid them. Growing children who wanted more than you could give. He imagined Eric and Sophie sitting at their small kitchen table after the kids were asleep, doing arithmetic with a frown, the way he and Martha had once done under a lamp that ran too hot. It wasn't an excuse. It was a picture. Pictures helped him work wood. Maybe they could help him work through this. He returned to the living room and turned on only the lamp by the window. Light pooled on the floorboards, showing every line of grain he had sanded until his elbows ached. He could walk the whole house in his mind and know where the best boards lay, where a knot hid under the runner, where the staircase creaked one step sooner in cold weather. He could point to a corner and say, "That joint fought me for 3 hours," and to another and say, "She spilled coffee there and we laughed until we cried." A man who builds his house builds a map of himself. Tonight, his map had missing borders. He set a log in the fireplace and coaxed flame to it the way he had taught Daniel in October. Patience, air, a careful teepee. The match angled like a pen writing heat into the bark. The first orange lick took and grew until the room softened, shadows flexing along the mantel. He lowered into the rug as if kneeling at an altar, and watched the fire lay its warm hands on the wood. He didn't feel old then. He felt like a man who had made something that could not be unmade in an evening. And yet he could hear Eric's voice as clearly as the ticking clock. What good is it if it doesn't help us now? Richard thought of the years he and Martha had spent saying no so they could say yes later. No to new trucks, no to trips, yes to mortgage payments, yes to insulation, yes to a porch that faced the sun where coffee tasted better. He had believed that the yes would live in his son's mouth someday. Perhaps that had been his mistake. Legacy you hold too tightly begins to feel like a chain in other people's hands. He rose and walked into the kitchen. The oak table he had built was scarred with conversations. Dings from Daniel's marbles, a long faint line where Clara's ruler had slipped while drawing houses. He poured water, then didn't drink it, then poured it out again. He wanted to do something with his hands. He opened drawers he didn't need to open, ran a dish towel between his fingers, found the recipe card where Martha's looped handwriting told a story about flour and spice and a brandy she pretended not to like. He pressed his thumb to the ink until it smudged a little, and then he laughed at himself quietly, because ghosts are just what you touch in your own heart when you can't touch what's gone. On the back porch, the night had hardened. The yard lay under a pale sheen of frost, the grass stiff as wire. He tugged his coat closed and stepped out anyway, breathing steam, listening to the neighborhood in winter gear, the muted whir of a far furnace fan, a dog's collar jingle, a car turning a corner 2 streets away. Mrs. Patterson's porch light blinked on, then off. Somewhere a wind chime troubled the dark with its thin silver voice. He remembered the afternoon years ago when he had raised the first wall of the house with 2 friends and a borrowed lift, how the studs had looked absurd in the sky, a square of private space held up against a wide, indifferent blue. Martha had brought lemonade in a mason jar and teased him about the way he squinted at level lines. "You stare at a thing long enough," she'd said, "and it starts staring back." He squinted now across the yard, but nothing stared back except his own breath. Back inside, he fetched a pad from the junk drawer and a pencil sharpened to a point so fine it could write a secret between heartbeat beats. He sat at the table and wrote the names he couldn't set down. Eric, Sophie, Daniel, Clara. He drew a box around the children and another around the adults without thinking. And when he noticed what his hand had done, he set the pencil down and pressed his brow. He did not want boxes. He wanted a table full of elbows and laughter and someone reaching for the salt and saying, "Pass that here, Dad." He didn't know how to fix what had been said tonight. He could not sand the words smooth or cut them back to grain. But he could do what he had always done when a project splintered in his hands. Stop. Breathe. Choose the right next cut. Pride had its uses. It made straight lines. Pride also had its dangers. It made men stubborn where they should be generous. He could separate one from the other if he worked carefully. He stood and went to the hallway where the thermostat glowed a little square of amber. He turned it 2 degrees warmer and felt foolish and then better. On the way back, he paused at the entry table. A small key lay there, old brass polished bright from years of pockets. He picked it up and rolled its bowed spine between thumb and forefinger. The key had weight. Most decisions that mattered did. He closed his fingers around it and did not open them again for a long half-minute. Tomorrow, he told himself. Not tonight, when anger still flickered under the ribs. Tomorrow, when the morning light came in clean through the kitchen window and the house remembered how to be a blessing. He would look at the numbers. He would look at what he had set aside for emergencies that had never arrived but could be named. He would see what could be spared without dismantling the roof over his head, without selling the story he and Martha had built into these walls. He would call his son and say something gentler than what the night had offered. Something like, "I want to help. Let's talk like men who remember who we are to each other." At the mantel again, he set the key beside the silver frame and met Martha's eyes. "I won't let him take you out of this house," he said, "but I will not let the children be hungry for things I can give." It felt right in his mouth, even with no one to argue back. The compromise was not a truce with fear. It was a covenant with love. He could live inside that difference. He turned off the lamp and the room fell into the patient glow of the fire. Upstairs, the bed would be cold when he slid into it. He would lay on his side and listen to the pipes click as they cooled, and he would practice what he would say in the morning until the sentences stopped hurting. Outside, frost was tightening its grip on the lawn, making each blade a small, bright blade of its own. Inside, Richard Hayes set the house tonight and went to find whatever sleep was left for him on a winter evening that would not end. Believing, because he had to, that morning still knew how to begin. Morning crept into the house in slow amber streaks, the kind of light that made the oak table in the kitchen glow like honey. Richard Hayes sat with both hands around his coffee cup, not for warmth. It had already gone lukewarm, but for steadiness. He had spent much of the night turning on his side, listening to the pipes tick and groan, reciting the words he wanted to say to Eric until they lost meaning. By the time the sun rose, the words had sharpened into a plan. He could not give away the house. That much was certain. The walls were more than plaster and paint. They were his story with Martha, the laughter of birthdays, the careful steps of first grandchildren toddling across hardwood floors he had sanded until his knees burned. But perhaps there was something else, something he could offer that would ease the strain, a gesture to show that he was not his son's enemy. He rose from the table, set the cold coffee in the sink, and walked upstairs to the bedroom that had grown cavernous since Martha passed. The curtains whispered against the frost-etched window. He crossed to the closet, its cedar lining faint but still clinging to Martha's dresses that he had never found the courage to box away. Behind them, hidden in the paneling, sat the small wall, safe, its brass dial gleaming softly in the dim light. Richard knelt, his knees protesting on the hardwood. His hand hovered over the dial, remembering the years of discipline it had taken to feed this little vault. 20 here, 50 there. Over time, checks slipped inside instead of dinners out. Martha had teased him once, calling him her squirrel, hoarding away bits of winter grain. But she had also touched his cheek afterward and said, "You never know when the children will need us." The lock clicked, a sound both mechanical and intimate, and the door swung open. Inside lay the bundles, 15 neat stacks of bills wrapped with elastic, their green faces softened by years of waiting. $15,000. He touched them as one might touch something alive, not because of the money itself, but because of what each bill represented. Truck repairs he had postponed, fishing trips declined, new suits never purchased, sacrifices small and large, all distilled into this quiet weight of paper. He lifted a stack and felt its heft in his palm. Not enough to buy a house, no, but enough for a down payment, enough to shift a family out of an apartment and into something where Daniel could spread out his Lego castles and Clara could pin her drawings to her own wall. Enough to say, "I see you. I care. You will not struggle alone." Richard's throat tightened. He imagined calling Eric, his son's voice on the line, raw from last night's anger, He imagined himself saying, "I'm sorry for how things ended. I have something for you. Let's start over." He wanted to believe the money could be a bridge, not a wedge. He wanted to believe Eric would hear the love hidden in each folded bill, rather than the insufficiency of the amount. He counted again just to hear the soft click of paper against paper, the rhythm soothing in its certainty. Then he replaced the money inside, but this time left the safe unlocked. It felt symbolic, as though he were leaving the door open not just for cash, but for reconciliation. "Tomorrow," he told himself, "tomorrow I'll call." Rising slowly, he let his gaze drift to Martha's dresses swaying faintly in the draft. "You always knew how to mend broken things," he whispered. "I'll try to do the same." Downstairs, the fire had burned to embers. The living room gray and quiet, he set another log and watched it catch. The day ahead felt heavier than most, but also fragile, like glass that might either hold water or shatter in a hand too quick. For the first time since last night's confrontation, Richard felt a thread of hope. Fragile, yes, but hope nonetheless. The following morning unfolded in its usual rhythm, yet Richard felt every sound differently. The hiss of the kettle on the stove, the scrape of his chair across the oak floor, even the faint hum of the refrigerator. All of it seemed louder, heavier, as though the house itself was bracing for what was about to come. He had made up his mind last night, pacing between Martha's empty chair and the safe hidden in their closet. Now, with the decision solid in his chest, there was nothing left to do but carry it out. He reheated yesterday's coffee, though it tasted more like ash than warmth, and sat at the kitchen table with the phone resting just inches from his hand. The sunlight spilling through the frosted glass caught the familiar grooves of the wood he had sanded decades ago. This table had heard his children laugh, cry, even pound fists in frustration when homework proved too difficult. Now it would hear a conversation that felt heavier than any before. He dialed Eric's numbers slowly, as if spacing out the digits might give him time to change his mind. Each ring dragged out longer than the last. 2 rings, 3, and then his son's voice cut through, sharp and impatient. "What do you want, Dad?" Not a hello, not even a breath of warmth. Richard swallowed, steadying his tone. "Eric, I've been thinking about what you said, about family needing help. You were right. I want to do something for you." There was silence for a beat, then a sigh, the kind that carried annoyance rather than relief. "Go on. I have $15,000 in savings," Richard said carefully. "It's not much compared to the value of this house, I know. But it's something. It could help with a down payment. Get you and Sophie into a bigger place. A fresh start." On the other end, a bitter laugh burst out, so sharp it stung Richard's ear. 15,000? Is this a joke? Richard frowned, his fingers tightening around the phone. "It's everything I've managed to put aside, Eric. Every dollar came from long hours, overtime shifts, and sacrifices your mother and I made. It may not buy you a mansion, but it's real help." "A pathetic amount," Eric snapped. His voice rose, brimming with anger. "You're sitting on hundreds of thousands in equity, Dad, and you throw me scraps like this? 15,000 doesn't even cover the closing costs on a decent place." Richard felt his jaw clench, but he forced his voice to remain calm. "Son, it's not scraps. It's love. It's the best I can give without losing the roof over my own head. I thought you might see it for what it is." "Love?" Eric barked, almost laughing again. "You call this love? You're a greedy old man. You'd rather rot in that shrine to Mom than actually help your living family. You sit there with your precious memories while your grandchildren grow up cramped and suffocated. You don't care about us. You care about your house." The mention of Martha, twisted into a weapon, cut deeper than anything else. "Don't you dare!" Richard began, his voice trembling now with fury. "Oh, face it, Dad," Eric interrupted. "You'll die in that house alone, clutching to the past, and we'll sell it anyway. Why not do something useful with it now? unless you're too selfish to admit you owe us." The line went dead. Richard lowered the receiver slowly, his hand shaking despite his effort to steady it. The dial tone buzzed in his ear until he placed the phone back on its cradle. He stared at the wall across from him, at the familiar paint Martha had chosen, at the photograph of Daniel's crooked grin taped to the refrigerator. His body felt heavy, as though the words his son had just thrown at him were weights pressing into his shoulders. His mind replayed the insults again and again. Greedy, useless, selfish. The house, a life's work with Martha, dismissed as nothing more than an obstacle to Eric's ambition. Her memory, reduced to ashes in his son's mouth. Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, and walked into the living room. His eyes fell on the wedding photo of Martha in her yellow dress. Her eyes crinkled in laughter. He lifted it from the mantel, his hand trembling so badly he almost dropped it. For the first time in years, tears blurred her image until all he could see was a streak of yellow and silver. Where had his son gone? The boy who once helped him hammer nails into the porch, who had cried on his shoulder when he broke his arm, who had been proud to hand him screws and hold boards straight while they built together. All that seemed gone, replaced by a man who looked at him not as a father, but as an obstacle. The house suddenly felt colder. Richard set the photograph back on the mantel with deliberate care, as though placing a fragile piece of himself back where it belonged. The decision was clear now, written in the bitter tone of Eric's words. The 15,000 had meant nothing to him. His son didn't want help. He wanted the house. And for that, Richard realized he was willing to destroy the very bond that had once meant everything. For 2 days after the phone call, the house felt like a tomb. Richard moved from room to room as if each space carried the echo of his son's voice. The venom threaded through every word. He tried to busy himself with repairs, tightening a loose hinge on the porch door, clearing leaves from the gutters, but even those tasks, once a comfort, only reminded him that he worked alone. He had half expected Eric to call back with an apology, a sign of regret, something to show that beneath the anger there was still a son who cared. But the phone remained silent, and Richard told himself that perhaps silence was better than hearing those words again. On the third evening, just as the last light drained out of the sky and frost began creeping across the lawn, the phone rang. Its shrill tone cut through the house like an intruder. Richard hesitated, staring at it as if the receiver itself were capable of betrayal. Finally, he lifted it. "Dad?" Eric's voice was softer this time, almost hesitant. Richard braced himself. "Yes, Eric. I've been thinking about what I said." A pause, as though the words were being pried loose. "I was out of line. I let my frustration get the better of me. Sophie's been telling me I need to make this right." From the background came the faint murmur of his daughter-in-law's voice, pitched low and urgent. Richard couldn't make out the words, but the tone was coaxing, rehearsed. "I appreciate you calling," Richard said cautiously. Eric cleared his throat. "We want you to come to Christmas Eve dinner. Sophie's making a roast. The kids have been asking about you nonstop. Daniel wants to show you his Lego fort, and Clara's been working on a new drawing for you. They miss you, Dad. We all do." Richard's chest tightened. He imagined Daniel's eager face, Clara's small hands clutching a sheet of paper, her eyes bright with pride. The thought warmed him, even as suspicion curled in the back of his mind. Could a son who spat such venom only days before truly have softened this quickly? Still, the longing for his grandchildren was a tug too strong to ignore. "That's thoughtful of you," he said slowly. "But are you certain this is what you want? After everything—" "It is," Eric interrupted quickly. "We've all had time to cool down. I don't want to fight anymore. I want us to be a family again." There was a strain beneath the smoothness of his voice, something brittle that didn't quite convince Richard, but Sophie's voice floated through in the background, louder now. "Tell him we'll set his seat at the head of the table." Eric repeated it, word for word. "You'll sit at the head, Dad, where you belong." Richard closed his eyes. The image was so vivid. Him at the head of the table, Daniel at his side, Clara passing him the cranberry sauce, laughter weaving through the air. For one moment, he let himself believe it. Perhaps the bitterness had burned itself out, leaving only ash. Perhaps this was their way of offering an olive branch. "I'll come," he said finally. "Good," Eric replied, his voice light with relief. "Come around 6. And Dad, thank you for giving us another chance." The line clicked, leaving Richard in a silence that was both heavy and strangely hopeful. He set the phone down and walked to the mantel. Martha's photograph caught the glow of the lamp, her eyes seeming to sparkle with secrets she could never speak. "Should I trust him?" Richard asked aloud, though he knew no answer would come. Still, he began to plan. He would bring gifts, Daniel's Lego set, Clara's art supplies, and he would bake Martha's Christmas pudding, the one recipe she had guarded like treasure, as though the sweetness could stitch together what bitterness had torn apart. That night, Richard wrote their names on small tags and tied them to packages with red ribbon. His hands steadied as he worked, the tremor of anger replaced by a tremor of longing. He wanted to believe in reconciliation. He wanted to believe that beneath pride and resentment, family could still be salvaged. But deep within, under the layers of hope, something whispered to him, quiet, insistent, that this invitation was not what it seemed. The morning of Christmas Eve arrived with a pale winter sun edging its way through the curtains, painting long golden stripes across the living room floor. Richard stirred from his chair by the fireplace, where he had dozed off with a blanket over his knees. For the first time in weeks, his heart felt lighter. The bitterness of the past days still pressed at the edges of his mind, but the thought of Daniel and Clara laughing at the dinner table brought a warmth that even the harsh December winds couldn't take away. He rose slowly, stretching his back until it gave its familiar pop, and moved toward the small list he had scribbled on the notepad beside the telephone. Gifts, wrapping paper, ingredients for Martha's pudding. The words looked simple enough, yet each line carried weight, a reminder of traditions and love that had outlasted grief. Bundled in his heavy coat and scarf, Richard drove into town. The streets were alive with holiday bustle, children tugging at their parents' hands, carolers in mismatched hats, shop windows glowing with tinsel and painted snowflakes. He parked outside the toy store and stepped inside, the warmth hitting him like an embrace. He found what he was looking for quickly, a large box of Lego bricks, the kind that promised endless castles and towers. He pictured Daniel's face lighting up, his small fingers already planning the next grand design. For Clara, he chose a set of colored pencils and a thick sketch pad with a cover that shimmered like frost under the light. He traced the embossed flowers on its surface, imagining her careful strokes, her determination to capture the world in color. At the counter, the clerk wrapped the gifts in bright paper, but Richard asked for plain red ribbon instead of bows. He tied them himself later, his large hands fumbling slightly, but he took his time. Each knot felt deliberate, a gesture of care. The grocery store was crowded, but Richard moved with quiet focus. He gathered flour, sugar, raisins, and the small bottle of brandy Martha had always insisted upon for her famous pudding. He could hear her voice as he picked up the ingredients. "Don't skimp on the raisins, Rich. The sweetness is the heart of it." Back home, he set the bags on the counter and rolled up his sleeves. The kitchen smelled of flour dust and spice as he worked, his movements steady and practiced. He hadn't made this pudding since the year Martha passed, but the recipe card lay before him, her handwriting looping across the page like music. He measured carefully, stirred slowly as though she were standing beside him, guiding his hands. As the mixture thickened, memories flooded in. He saw Martha at this same counter, her apron dusted with flour, laughing as Daniel sneaked raisins from the bowl. He remembered Clara perched on a stool, coloring while the oven warmed the whole room. Those memories ached, but they also steadied him, a reminder that love lived on in the things they had built together. When the pudding finally went into the oven, Richard leaned against the counter and inhaled deeply. The scent filled the house, rich and comforting, seeping into the very walls. He looked toward the mantel, toward Martha's picture. "You'd like this," he murmured. "Our grandkids enjoying your pudding, just like old times." The gifts sat wrapped and waiting on the dining table. The pudding baked golden and fragrant. Richard packed everything carefully into a basket, covering it with a clean towel embroidered by Martha long ago. His heart swelled with anticipation as he imagined arriving at Eric's home, setting the basket down and watching the children's faces light up. Yet as he loaded the basket into his car and caught his reflection in the window, he paused. The lines on his face were deeper than he remembered, his eyes carrying shadows he hadn't noticed before. For a moment, a whisper of doubt stirred. Was this truly reconciliation or something else? Entirely? He shook the thought away. Tonight was Christmas Eve. Tonight he would see his grandchildren. Tonight, perhaps, there would be healing. With the pudding cooling in its dish and the gifts tucked safely in the trunk, Richard Hayes set off down the snowy road, carrying with him hope that the evening would restore what anger had tried to take. The drive across town was slow, the roads lined with frosted trees that glittered like crystal in the headlights. Richard kept both hands steady on the wheel, though his thoughts drifted between hope and unease. The basket on the seat beside him gave off the faintest scent of Martha's pudding, warm and sweet, as if the dish itself were whispering reassurance. He imagined Daniel's wide grin when he saw the Lego set, Clara's shy delight when he handed her the sketch pad. Those thoughts steadied him, carrying him through the long, quiet miles. Eric's neighborhood looked cheerful, dressed in twinkling lights and wreaths on every door. He parked by the curb, taking in the glow of his son's house. Candles flickered in the windows. Laughter carried faintly through the cold air. For a moment, Richard stood outside the car, basket in hand, simply watching the life inside. His breath clouded in front of him, each puff fading quickly, just as doubt tried to fade beneath the glow of the holiday. The front door opened before he could knock. "Dad!" Sophie's voice rang out smooth and welcoming. She stood in a deep red dress, her hair swept neatly back, her smile warm but just a touch too polished. Still, Richard inclined his head politely. "Merry Christmas, Sophie." He held up the basket. "Brought something for dinner." Her eyes flickered to the towel covering the pudding, then back to his face with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That smells wonderful." Come in. The kids will be thrilled to see you." The warmth hit him first, the blast of heat from the fireplace, the hum of conversation, the smell of roast and cinnamon, then the sound of small footsteps pounding against the floor. "Grandpa!" Daniel barreled into him, nearly knocking the basket from his hands. Richard laughed, setting it down quickly so he could catch the boy in his arms. The child's energy was boundless, his cheeks flushed pink from excitement. "I made a fort," Daniel blurted, words tumbling over themselves. "It's got 3 towers and a drawbridge, and Mom says you can be the king." Richard's throat tightened as he hugged the boy. "I'd be honored." Clara followed, her sketchpad already clutched to her chest. "I drew something for you," she said, her voice soft, eyes bright as polished glass. She flipped open the cover to reveal a sketch of a house, windows glowing, a tree beside it heavy with ornaments. At the top, in careful block letters, she had written, "Home." Richard swallowed hard. "It's beautiful, Clara. Just beautiful." He kissed the top of her head, feeling the fine hair tickle his cheek. Eric appeared from the dining room, wiping his hands on a towel. He wore a sweater Richard didn't recognize, his expression open, even cheerful. "Dad, I'm glad you came." For a heartbeat, Richard stared at him, searching for cracks in the facade. But Eric's smile held steady, his voice easy. He extended his hand, and Richard hesitated only a moment before shaking it. "I brought gifts," Richard said, gesturing to the basket, "and Martha's pudding. Thought the kids would like it. Eric clapped him on the shoulder. Perfect. We saved you a seat at the head of the table. The dining room was bright, the table gleaming with polished silverware and dishes steaming with food. Sophie moved gracefully among the settings, placing bowls of vegetables, smoothing napkins, her every motion practiced. The children darted back and forth, giggling, their joy filling the spaces where suspicion tried to creep in. Richard's chair stood at the head of the table, just as promised. He lowered himself into it slowly, his eyes sweeping the room. The tree glowed in the corner, ornaments reflecting light like small jewels. The fire snapped in the hearth. Laughter bubbled around him. For a moment, it felt almost real, almost like the Christmases of years gone by, when Martha sat beside him and Eric was still a boy full of promise. Sophie poured wine into tall glasses, her hand steady, her smile unwavering. She set one gently before Richard, the deep red liquid catching the glow of the candles. Eric raised his own glass. "To family," he said, his voice carrying just enough weight to sound genuine. Richard lifted his glass, his eyes flicking briefly to Martha's pudding in the center of the table, as though her presence lingered there too. He touched his glass to Eric's, the crystal clinking softly, and smiled faintly at his grandchildren. "To family," he echoed, though in the quiet corners of his mind the whisper of doubt had not left him. The dinner stretched on in warmth and color, the kind of evening Richard had almost convinced himself was possible again. The roast sat tender and fragrant at the center of the table. Bowls of potatoes and vegetables passed from hand to hand, while Clara's giggles and Daniel's eager chatter filled the room like music. Richard ate slowly, savoring not only the food but the nearness of his grandchildren, the brush of their sleeves against his, the way their eyes shone with the uncomplicated joy of Christmas Eve. For a while he let himself believe in it. Perhaps Eric had truly set aside his bitterness. Perhaps the apology had been real. Perhaps tonight was not a trap, but a turning point. The thought settled over him like the warmth of the fire, tempting him to lay down the weight he had carried since that night at the door. Then came the toast. Sophie rose gracefully, lifting the bottle of wine she had uncorked earlier. "A proper Christmas dinner deserves a proper toast," she said, her voice smooth as polished wood. She filled Eric's glass first, then Richard's, then her own, and finally the children's smaller cups with sparkling cider. Richard glanced at his glass, the ruby-red liquid glimmering in the candlelight. He wasn't a heavy drinker, never had been, but he would sip tonight, for the children's sake, for the appearance of harmony. As Sophie moved back toward her seat, Eric leaned forward, pretending to adjust the serving dish in front of Richard. His hand moved quickly, too quickly, and in that flicker of a moment, Richard saw it, a small packet, paper thin, emptied into his wine with a casual flick of the wrist. The powder dissolved instantly, leaving no trace but the faintest swirl that vanished in seconds. Richard's breath caught, but he did not move. His face remained still, his hands folded loosely in his lap. Only his eyes shifted, watching his son's hand withdraw, watching the easy smile spread across Eric's face as he lifted his own glass. "To family," Eric said again, his voice rich and confident. Sophie echoed him, her glass raised high. "To family." The children lifted their cider cups, their laughter bubbling as they joined in. Richard's heart hammered in his chest, not from fear, but from the cold, steady realization of what he had just witnessed. His own son, blood of his blood, had prepared this moment as carefully as he had once prepared toy forts and wooden projects at Richard's side. Only now the construction was poison. He looked down at his glass. The wine glowed darkly, its surface calm and inviting. It would be so easy to lift it, to drink as expected, to let the trap close around him. But Richard Hayes had not survived 65 years, the death of his beloved wife, and decades of toil to be undone by a son who mistook greed for love. He forced his breathing into rhythm, steady and slow, and when the family clinked glasses, he clinked his too. The sound rang light and cheerful across the table. "Family," Richard said, his voice even. He lifted the glass, tipped it slightly as though preparing to drink. Then, with a small shift hidden by the movement of Sophie setting down the bottle, he placed it back on the table. His hand slid across the linen, casual, unhurried, and in that movement he made the switch. His glass for Eric's. Their places seamlessly exchanged as the laughter of children masked the scrape of crystal on wood. Eric, unaware, lifted his glass high. "To second chances," he added, his smile broad and convincing. Then he drank deeply. Richard, his own glass untouched, merely raised it to his lips, letting the wine brush against them without crossing the line. His eyes did not leave his son's face. The powder was gone, dissolved, invisible. But its shadow lingered in Richard's mind, colder than any winter wind. The crystal glasses clinked one final time, and for a heartbeat, the room seemed suspended, laughter frozen in the air, candlelight caught mid-flicker, Richard's pulse a drum echoing inside his ribs. He had felt the weight of this moment gathering all evening, and now it had come to rest squarely in his hands, or rather in Eric's. His son tipped the glass back with practiced ease, swallowing greedily. The red wine slid down, carrying with it the invisible bitterness Eric himself had planned for another. Richard's own glass, switched so neatly only moments before, remained untouched on the white linen. He lifted it just enough to touch his lips, letting the rim brush his skin without tasting a drop. Across the table, Daniel let out a burst of laughter at something Clara whispered. Their small voices were the only pure sound in the room. Richard's gaze never left his son. He watched Eric's Adam's apple rise and fall as he drained the last of his toast. Watched the self-assured smile curve his lips, the smugness of a man convinced he had regained control of the story. Then it began. At first, Eric's expression merely faltered, a twitch at the corner of his mouth, a blink too rapid, a cough pressed hastily into his fist. He reached for his napkin, dabbing at his lips as though the discomfort were minor, fleeting. Sophie leaned toward him with a frown, her polished smile slipping for the first time all night. "You all right?" she murmured. Eric nodded too quickly, his hand tightening around the stem of the empty glass. His breath grew shallow. He coughed again, harder this time, the sound tearing through the warmth of the room. The children fell silent, their eyes wide. Richard set his glass down gently, the faint clink of crystal on wood, marking the calmest gesture in a storm about to break. His heart was steady now, his earlier suspicion resolved into certainty. He had not been wrong. The invitation, the apology, the seat at the head of the table, it had all been a performance, leading to this moment. Eric's face flushed, then paled. A bead of sweat broke across his temple, despite the chill outside. His hand trembled as he pushed back his chair, the legs scraping sharply against the floorboards. He staggered toward the hall, nearly knocking over a serving dish, his body lurching as if some unseen weight dragged him down. "Eric!" Sophie's voice cracked, sharp and frightened. She sprang up, following him as he stumbled out of the dining room. The sound of retching echoed faintly from down the hall, violent and raw. The children sat frozen, Daniel clutching Clara's hand, their eyes darting between the doorway and their grandfather. Richard did not move. He folded his napkin carefully, laying it across his lap as though nothing were amiss. He reached for the bowl of potatoes, scooped a portion onto his plate, and let the silence grow thick around him. When Sophie reappeared in the doorway, her face pale, her voice trembled with fury. "What did you do?" Richard lifted his eyes slowly, calmly. "I didn't do anything." He picked up his fork, his tone quiet but edged with iron. "I switched our glasses." Her lips parted, the denial caught on her tongue. Behind her, the sound of Eric's suffering filled the house, undeniable and damning. The silence that followed was heavier than the winter night pressing against the windows. It was the silence of truth, finally laid bare, of traps sprung not on the intended prey, but on the one who set them. Richard took his first bite of dinner, his eyes never leaving Sophie's stricken face. The sounds from the hallway grew worse, echoing through the house with a violence that no one at the table could ignore. The retching was guttural, followed by the hollow crash of something striking the floor. Sophie spun on her heels, her elegant composure shattered, and rushed to Eric's side. Daniel and Clara clung to each other, their eyes wide, too young to understand, but old enough to feel the terror spreading through the room like smoke. Richard set his fork down neatly beside his plate. He listened without rising, his expression calm, his breathing steady. The flames in the hearth crackled, filling the silence between each sound of Eric's suffering. It was a cruel counterpoint, the warmth of the fire against the cold truth unraveling just beyond the doorway. "Eric!" Sophie's voice came again, shrill now, thick with panic. She reappeared in the doorway for a moment, her face blanched, her lipstick smeared where she had bitten her lip. He's not well. Call an ambulance." Richard tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words, then reached for his glass of water instead of the poisoned wine. He sipped, set it down, and folded his napkin with deliberate care. "An ambulance won't change the fact that he poured something into my drink," he said quietly, and then drank it himself. Her eyes flashed with rage and fear, darting toward the children who sat trembling in their seats. She lowered her voice to a hiss. "They don't need to hear this." Richard rose slowly, the chair legs scraping against the polished floor. He stood tall, shoulders squared, his presence filling the room in a way that silenced even Sophie's fury. "They need to know the truth," he said, his voice calm, each word measured. "So when they are older, they'll understand the kind of man their father chose to be." A muffled groan came from the hall, followed by the thud of Eric's body against the wall. The children whimpered, Clara burying her face against Daniel's shoulder. Sophie turned away from Richard and rushed back to her husband, her heels clicking in frantic rhythm. Richard stepped forward into the hall, his gaze falling on the sight he had anticipated, yet dreaded. Eric lay slumped against the wallpaper, his skin ashen, sweat beading across his brow. His breaths came shallow, ragged, his eyes darting between pain and panic. When Eric's gaze found his father's, there was no plea for forgiveness, no softened edges of regret, only raw fear and the faint, bitter glint of realization. Richard crouched down, resting his elbows on his knees, his voice low but steady. "You thought I wouldn't see. You thought I was blind to your hands, to your schemes. But I watched. I've always watched." Eric's lips parted, a rasp of breath escaping, but no words formed. His hand clawed weakly at his father's sleeve, more reflex than connection. Richard leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper only Eric could hear. "You built this moment yourself. Every lie, every insult, every betrayal led here. I did nothing but let you drink from your own cup." He rose again, letting Eric's grasp slip away, and turned back toward the dining room. Sophie stared at him with wide, accusing eyes, her hands trembling as she tried to dab Eric's forehead with a cloth. "You'll pay for this," she spat, her voice ragged. "If he dies—" Richard cut her off, his tone cold as stone. "If he dies, it will be because of his own hand. You and I both know what he poured into that glass. Tell the truth, Sophie, or keep lying. Either way, the weight will crush you." He returned to the table, his steps measured, and sat again at the head where the children still sat frozen. He placed his napkin across his lap and picked up his fork once more. The roast had cooled slightly, but he ate as though nothing had happened, the rhythm of his meal a sharp defiance against the chaos unraveling only steps away. In that moment, Richard Hayes became something more than a father wronged. He became a man who had stared betrayal in the face, allowed it to reveal its own poison, and chosen silence and composure as his sharpest blade. The house felt split in two, one half filled with the sounds of suffering and panic echoing down the hallway, the other half silent under the steady composure of Richard Hayes. He sat at the head of the table, his fork moving with deliberate calm, while Sophie's frantic footsteps beat a sharp counter rhythm against the hardwood. The children whispered to each other in hushed tones, unsure whether to run to their father or stay near the only calm figure left in the room. At last, Sophie reappeared in the doorway, her face a mask of fury and fear. Her carefully applied makeup was smudged now, her breath uneven. She held the frame of the door as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. "You can't just sit there," she snapped, her voice rising higher than it had all night. "He's your son. He needs help." Richard set his fork down gently, the clink against the plate louder in the tense silence. He wiped his mouth with his napkin before answering. "Help?" His tone was flat, cold. "He mixed his own glass. He planned this night, Sophie, not me." Her eyes widened, then darted quickly to Daniel and Clara, whose faces had turned pale with confusion. She lowered her voice, forcing a brittle smile. He just meant to scare you. That's all. A stupid prank. He never meant real harm." Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her as one might study a warped board, measuring the flaws, the cracks that no amount of sanding could fix. "Sleeping powder? Rat poison? Which prank was it tonight?" His voice was steady, but each word landed like a hammer. Sophie's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. The practiced charm she usually carried like armor had abandoned her. Her hands twisted the cloth in front of her, wringing it until the threads strained. "We've been under pressure," she said quickly, words tumbling out. "The bills, the apartment. Eric lost some hours at work. The children deserve better, and you're sitting in that big house with everything you've built, refusing to share." Her voice broke, but not from grief. It was desperation, raw and unpolished. "We didn't mean for it to go this far. We just needed you to understand how serious things are." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Understand? By killing me?" She flinched, her head shaking rapidly. No, it wasn't like that. It was just supposed to scare you. Make you realize we can't keep living like this. Eric got carried away, but it wasn't supposed to." He cut her off with a raised hand, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Don't you dare dress this in excuses. You stood by and let him do it. You smiled and poured the wine while he poisoned the glass meant for me. And now you're spinning stories because you're afraid the truth will swallow you whole." Sophie's face hardened, a flash of anger breaking through her fear. "If anyone hears about this, do you know what will happen? They'll believe you poisoned him. An old man, bitter over his son's words, jealous of his family. Who do you think they'll believe, Richard? You or me?" For the first time, Richard smiled. It was not a smile of joy, but of quiet, merciless certainty. He rose from his chair, his presence filling the room with a weight Sophie could not match. "They'll believe the truth," he said, "and the truth is this. Your husband raised a glass filled with his own treachery and drank every drop." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Tell the police, tell the neighbors, tell the children if you like. You and I both know what he did. The truth doesn't vanish because you're afraid of it." Sophie's breath caught, her eyes wide, her hands trembling as she backed away a step. The bravado drained from her face, leaving only the pale mask of a woman cornered by her own choices. Richard turned back toward the table, his hand brushing Clara's shoulder, gently, reassuringly, as he passed. "It's late," he said softly to the children. "You should get some rest." Then, with the calm dignity of a man who had endured betrayal and chosen silence as his sharpest weapon, he retrieved his coat from the rack by the door. The night outside was black and bitter, but it felt no colder than the house he was leaving behind. The hallway smelled of sickness and fear, a sour mix that clung to the wallpaper and settled into the carpet. Richard moved toward the door with unhurried steps, each footfall deliberate, as though he were counting the years of sacrifice that had brought him to this moment. Behind him, Sophie's voice cracked through the silence. "You can't walk away like this," she cried, still crouched beside her husband, who groaned faintly against the wall. If you leave, people will know. They'll say you abandoned him. They'll say you're to blame. Richard paused at the threshold of the dining room, turning just enough to meet her wild eyes. The children stood frozen behind him, their small hands clutching the edge of the table as if to hold on to some fragment of normalcy. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but carried the weight of stone. I owe you nothing, Sophie. Not excuses, not protection, and certainly not my life. Her mouth opened, trembling, but no words came. He bent slightly, reaching for his coat from the rack. The familiar weight of wool settled over his shoulders, the sleeves sliding down his arms with the steadiness of ritual. Martha had once stitched the inner lining herself, a faint reminder of her hands steadying his even now. He fastened the top button, his gaze still fixed on Sophie. You should tell them the truth, he said softly. Tell them your husband tried to poison his father and drank from his own glass. Tell them you stood by while he did it. Or keep lying. Either way, it will live with you long after I am gone. Her face twisted, torn between fury and despair. You'll regret this, she whispered. I'll make sure of it. Richard straightened, his posture firm. No, Sophie. The only one with regrets here will be him, if he survives long enough to remember. He turned to the children, softening his expression as he knelt briefly to their level. Daniel's eyes were wide, searching while Clara's lips trembled as though holding back tears. Richard reached out, placing a steadying hand on each of their shoulders. None of this is your fault, he said gently. Remember that. You are better than the choices your parents made tonight. Clara leaned into his hand for just a moment, as though seeking comfort, before he rose again. He stepped toward the front door, his boots heavy against the floorboards that creaked under his weight. Grandpa, are you coming back? Daniel's small voice called after him. Richard hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. He didn't turn, but his voice softened with a note of sorrow. Someday, Daniel, when this house remembers how to be a safe place again. The night air rushed in as he opened the door, bitter cold against his face. He stepped outside, pulling the collar of his coat tighter around his neck. Behind him, the doorframe glowed faintly with warmth and chaos, a house cracked open by greed and deception. Ahead of him stretched the long road home, quiet under the weight of fresh snow. As the door closed with a heavy thud, Richard Hayes walked into the winter darkness. Without a backward glance, he carried no anger in his stride, only the cold certainty of a man who had faced betrayal and left it to collapse under its own poison. And in the silence that followed, his final words lingered like frost on the air, an unshakable reminder that truth, once spoken, could never be buried again. The morning after Christmas dawned gray, the kind of sky that seemed to press low against the earth. Richard Hayes sat at his kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he hadn't touched. The silence in his house was familiar, but not comforting. It was heavy, saturated with the echoes of the night before. He could still hear Eric's choking, Sophie's frantic pleas, the children's frightened whispers. Those sounds clung to him like smoke, seeping into every thought. On the table beside his untouched coffee lay a small, leather folder, scuffed from years of handling. It contained documents Martha had once insisted they keep organized, insurance papers, savings bonds, and the will they had drafted together 2 decades earlier. Back then it had been simple. Everything would pass to Eric, their only child. Martha had believed it was only fair. He's our son, Rich, she had said with that gentle certainty that often softened his stubbornness. He'll carry on what we built. Now, staring at that folder, Richard felt the bitter weight of betrayal settle in his chest. The boy Martha had trusted, the man Richard had raised, had proven himself unworthy of that legacy. A legacy was not meant to be squandered in greed or twisted into poison. It was meant to protect, to provide, to honor what came before. By noon, Richard was parked outside the office of Lawrence Pierce, his longtime attorney. The building was an old brick structure on Main Street, its windows fogged against the cold. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of leather and paper. "Richard," Lawrence greeted him with a firm handshake, his eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of the older man's drawn expression. "Didn't expect to see you the day after Christmas. What's on your mind?" Richard lowered himself into the chair across from the oak desk. "I need to change my will." Lawrence leaned back, studying him. "That's a serious decision." "Something happen?" Richard's jaw tightened. "My son made his choices clear to me. He won't get this house. Not a dime more than I'm willing to give. I want everything rewritten." The attorney's pen hovered over his notepad. "How do you want it divided?" Richard spoke with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. "The house and the bulk of my savings go to the veterans' charity Martha and I used to donate to. They'll take care of people who truly need it. A portion, small but enough, will be placed in trusts for Daniel and Clara. They can access it when they turn 25. They deserve a chance at a better start than their parents gave them." Lawrence nodded slowly, writing in neat strokes. "And Eric?" "Nothing," Richard said, his voice like iron. "Not a cent? He has already taken more from me than I ever thought possible. The only inheritance he'll receive is the memory of what he tried to do." The attorney looked up, his brow furrowed. "Richard, are you certain? Cutting the child out entirely can lead to challenges, disputes." "I'm certain," Richard interrupted. His gaze didn't waver. "If he contests it, he'll have to stand in front of a judge and explain why his father cut him off. Let him. The truth is more damning than any lie he could invent." For a long moment, the room was silent, except for the scratching of Lawrence's pen. Finally, the lawyer pushed the papers forward. "Sign here." Richard took the pen, his hand steady. With each stroke of his signature, he felt a weight lift, replaced by a sharper, colder resolve. This was not cruelty. It was justice. Justice for Martha, for the years of sacrifice, for the love twisted into greed. When the last page was signed, he slid the pen back across the desk. Lawrence gathered the documents, sealing them into their folder once more. "It's done," he said. Richard rose, buttoning his coat. "No," he murmured, his voice firm. "It's only beginning." As he stepped back into the winter afternoon, the air felt sharper, cleaner. For the first time in months, the house that waited for him did not feel like a burden of memories, but a shield of truth. His legacy was secure, not in the hands of a son who had tried to poison him, but in the quiet promise of justice that would outlive them all. The days that followed passed in a slow, icy rhythm. Winter held the town tightly, each morning weighed down with frost, each night stretched long and silent. In that stillness, Richard Hayes found a strange peace. The chaos of Christmas Eve no longer haunted his every breath. Instead, he carried himself with the quiet certainty of a man who had endured betrayal and emerged with truth as his ally. News of Eric's collapse spread quickly through the neighborhood. Whispers circulated, paramedics at the house, Sophie's frantic shouts, the children crying as flashing lights painted the snow. Neighbors speculated about illness, stress, or some nameless infection. But Richard remained silent. He neither confirmed nor denied. He let the weight of suspicion rest where it belonged, inside the very walls where the treachery had taken place. Sophie called once, her voice sharp with accusation and pleading in equal measure. "He's weak, but alive," she said. "You can fix this, Richard. You can tell people you made a mistake, that it was all confusion." Richard listened until her words became noise. Then he cut her off, his voice calm, each syllable deliberate. "The truth will outlive your lies, Sophie. I won't lift a finger to save the man who tried to bury me, nor will I save the woman who watched." He hung up before she could reply. At home, Richard moved deliberately through the rooms. He polished the mantel where Martha's photograph stood, her smile eternal, her eyes carrying a spark that reminded him why he had chosen dignity over despair. Each night, he lit a fire in the hearth and sat with a journal, writing letters addressed to no one but her. "I did what I had to, Martha," he wrote. "I kept what we built safe. I made sure it will not be squandered." One afternoon, a thick envelope arrived from Lawrence Pierce's office. Inside lay copies of his newly signed will, each page a fortress against the greed that had nearly destroyed him. He ran his hand over the embossed seal, feeling the permanence of the decision. The house, the savings, all safeguarded for charity and for the grandchildren who had not yet learned how deeply parents could fail. Eric's name was nowhere to be found. That night, as snow fell in soft curtains outside his window, Richard stood before the mantel. He placed the folder beside Martha's photograph, the documents heavy with promise. "It's done," he whispered. "They can't touch what was ours. The children will know the truth when the time is right, and your name will not be stained by what he tried to do." The fire crackled, shadows dancing across the room, and for the first time in years the silence felt less like loneliness and more like justice. Christmas decorations still lingered on the street outside, lights twinkling faintly against the night. But inside Richard's house there was no glitter, no false cheer, only the steady warmth of a man who had taken back control of his story. He lowered himself into his chair, his hands resting on the arms like a king on his throne. He thought of Eric, perhaps still lying in a hospital bed, perhaps waking each morning with the memory of poison on his tongue. That was punishment enough. Richard didn't need to raise his voice or his hand. The silence itself was the blade, sharper than any vengeance shouted in anger. When the clock struck midnight, he raised his glass of water, not wine, and looked into Martha's eyes in the silver frame. "To family," he said softly, the words stripped of pretense now, heavy with truth, "to the family worth keeping." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the streets, the houses, and eventually the footprints of betrayal. What remained was cold, quiet justice, served not with rage but with dignity, and with the unshakable strength of a man who refused to be broken. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from,